The student feedback surveys are available. Please take 10 minutes to complete a survey for the subject this semester. We look forward to hearing your feedback and discovering what worked and what didn't work. In this final lecture, we are going to review some of the ideas that we've covered in the semester. And we're going to introduce one final new idea, and that is the concept of aural diversity. Looking back over the semester, we can get a sense of what the term audio culture refers to by looking at the sorts of concepts we've looked at in the lectures themselves. So we started off by considering music, politics, from both a personal and a public perspective. Music, after all, is one of the main reasons why many of us came here to study. We then tried to characterize audio content in terms of a range of different audio content types: dialogue, music, sound effects, and atmospheres. The term culture often refers to artistic or creative practice, and so we made sure that we got the perspective of some artists and musicians. We spoke to Indigenous Australian singer Rebecca Hatch and the Australian artists Jasmine Guffon and Robert Kugenvan. We looked at ways of knowing the world through sound, and we considered the concept of the soundscape. We then looked at the regulation of audio in the community and considered issues to do with the ethics of audio, copyright, and what we can learn from Indigenous Australian music and sound production. Another way of looking at culture is as a set of material artifacts, and so we spent some time considering the audio-specific technological artifacts that have developed in the context of Western culture over the last 500 years. As much of our thinking about the world today is driven by economics and corporations, it makes sense for us to think about corporate audio culture in terms of audio branding. There are many employment opportunities for us as well in this growing area. We started to consider ways of listening and listening culture. Listening, after all, is one of the key skills that you will be developing over the next 3 years. And it's important to have a sense of the mechanics of how listening takes place. And finally, we're looking at a new area called aural diversity, which considers the reality of the audience for who we are making new music and sound design material. Another way of considering the field of audio culture is to review the readings. Now, many of the readings parallel the content in the lectures. We started with a classic text from the Canadian composer and theorist Murray Schafer, The Music of the Environment, in which he considered how sound has changed in Western culture and how in many ways we have become less sensitive to the aural environment since the advent of recorded sound. We also read the work of sociologist David Hesmondhalgh, in which he tried to establish the reasons why music matters so much to each and every one of us. Of course, audio media are an important touchpoint for us in music and sound design, and so we looked back at the structure of radio media from the perspective of the theorist and composer Barry Truax. We discussed acoustomology, and we looked at the work of Stephen Feld with the Kululi people of the New Guinea Highlands, and how they represent the fact that we can know the world through sound in unique and culturally specific ways. Linking back to the creative and cultural aspect of sound, we considered the concept of sound art, its origins, development, and how it sits uncomfortably between gallery art practices and musical practices. We also looked at the preservation and presentation of audio artifacts in the context of museums, and how music and sound design can be used within the gallery and museum context. We briefly introduced the concept of sound walking. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to do some sound walking practice together, but we looked at the origins of this practice with the American artist Max Neuhaus. We considered the ethics and regulation through the very useful guidelines provided by the Australia Council for the Arts Protocols for working with Indigenous Australian artists. And we considered how traditional Australian Indigenous culture can help us to understand the ethics of sound and the ideas around ownership in a much more subtle and nuanced way. Once again, we had a reading from Murray Schafer where he considered the changes that took place as a result of recorded and broadcast sound. And we were introduced to some of the important concepts around audio branding. Our penultimate reading looked at listening from the perspective of anthropological studies. And finally, we're looking at listening in terms of aural diversity. So when we started out, we tried to come up with some definitions for audio culture, and I think we've come a long way in that trajectory. We've considered audio culture as a set of cultural products: music, art, radio, TV, films, and games. We've considered audio culture in terms of cultural and political expression, and particularly music as a tool for cultural political expression, and also the role of radio broadcasting in the manipulation of political attitudes. We've considered audio culture as a set of shared meanings, but also as a way in which people differentiate themselves from each other. Those who listen to classical music are differentiated through their musical choices from those who listen to, for example, hip-hop, and our choices in terms of music help to structure and express our identity. We also considered audio culture as a set of rules for the use of recorded cultural artifacts, particularly through the regulation of copyright. We considered audio culture as a set of material audio technologies, and of course, as these technologies change, our practices of musical consumption and production also change. By focusing on listening, we're considering audio culture as a set of embodied practices, that is, things we do with our bodies. And we might also think of Barry Truax's idea of the acoustic community as a set of shared understandings and practices around music and sound. So now we're going to introduce this rather interesting concept of aural diversity. John Drier proposes that, with its inclusion of hearing impairments and hearing aids as factors that may influence auditory sensation, within the criteria of the new International Standard Definition and Conceptual Framework of Soundscape, we witness a sea change in how standards in acoustics may regard hearing not as a fixed, universal and generalizable metric predicated on the otologically normal, but as a shifting, unsteady human trait that we individually, tacitly know from day-to-day experience. So this kind of thinking about listening, diversity, and what we might call normative aspects of listening comes from a focus on embodied experience of the world. We might think of the human body as situated centrally in the context of audio cultures. On one side, we have the cultural products of audio culture: music, film, radio. On the other side, we have the technologies of production and consumption: broadcast media, production equipment, digital networks. In the center here, we have the human body. Now, I've used the terms actual and virtual. So when we're thinking about human bodies in virtual terms, we might, for example, think of the male and female sex as virtual concepts. They suggest some kind of norm or standard in the way bodies are physically configured. But the actual reality is that each body is unique in its physical structure. Similarly, we might think of listening in terms of its actual and virtual dimensions. Now, the virtual dimension is described in standards documents which help engineers to understand what a typical or normal human listener is like. But actual human bodies, once again, actual listeners, are each individual and unique as a result of their personal, cultural, and life experience. So the normal, or what I would call technocultural listener, is defined by standards such as the International Standards Organization Acoustic Standard for Normal Equal Loudness Level Contours. So this graph shows frequency on the horizontal axis from 10 Hz to 100 kHz and sound pressure level on the vertical axis from the threshold of hearing at 0 dBSPL up to what is known as the threshold of pain at 120 or 130 decibels. Now, what these curves show is that the ear is not equally sensitive to all frequencies, and that in fact our ears are most sensitive to frequencies in the range of 3.5 kHz. Now, the red curve at the very bottom marked threshold shows the average minimum sensitivity, the quietest sound that we can hear, and this is shown as 0 dBSPL at 1 kHz. And you can see that we're much less sensitive to sound at lower frequencies and much less sensitive to sound at higher frequencies. Now, normal speech occurs at around 50 dBSPL, and these curves represent what's known as a FON level. So normal speech is situated somewhere between 40 and 60 FONs. To demonstrate this, I am going to play some pure tones which are matched as similar loudness, at least in my headphones, at 100 Hz, 1000 Hz, and 10 kHz. On this diagram, I've indicated the gain adjustments that were required for me to achieve similar loudness levels. First, a pure tone at 1000 Hz. These are the three tones we will hear. Now I'm going to show a similar demonstration, but this time with a random noise signal 1/3 of an octave wide, centered at 100, 1000, and 10,000 Hz. The concept of aural diversity was introduced by John Drier and Andrew Hugel, both composers and academic researchers. And they asked the question, whose hearing is it that is being referred to by these standards? Whose hearing is being referred to in these standards? Now, another place to look for standards are standards for noise control and environmental noise pollution. The World Health Organization's guidelines for community noise state that protective standards are essentially derived from observations on the health effects of noise on normal or average populations, who are usually adults and are selected because of their easy availability. However, vulnerable groups of people are typically underrepresented. So the experiments that were developed to establish the equal loudness contours, the participants in those laboratory-based experiments were probably European or North American adults or university students who were easily available to the researchers. In his paper about aural diversity, John Drier highlights the lack of thoughtful design that goes into everyday devices, and the example that he chooses are the hand dryers that are typically found in public toilets. So I thought I'd do a little bit of my own survey, and I went and captured the sound of some of these hand dryers. Okay, so I focused on this last dryer because I thought that it was actually probably the most effective hand dryer and was also the least loud. The worst out of all of these is the Dyson, which is kind of ironic because this company focuses its advertising campaign on its design prowess. I don't know if you've noticed how revoltingly filthy these dryers look. In my opinion, they're not that well designed at all, and certainly from an acoustic point of view, the design is appalling. So, to answer the question, whose hearing are product designers and standards documents describing, John Drier proposes the socio-cultural concept of the aural typical and aural diversity. The anecdotes that he's collected for his research, I'm going to spend some time reading them with you because I think they really help to open up our imagination to what kinds of diverse experiences listeners, real world listeners, have. And as young people, as designers starting out, it's important that you start to consider what this aural diversity really looks and sounds like. So the first story is of a single woman in her 80s who is enabled by a wheelchair, who looks forward to her weekly Sunday church visit. But due to recruitment, which is a common condition with older people that experience a combination of deafness and a diminished tolerance of loud sounds, the impressive church organ in her church creates unbearable pain. She perseveres, however, and sits every week during the service in an adjoining hall. They introduce the story of an 8-year-old boy with Asperger's syndrome who attends a normal state junior school. To cope with the classroom noise made by his classmates, he's encouraged to wear ear defenders. He loves swimming and diving deep down in the water where he finds relative tranquility. His sensitivity, however, can shift from the hyperacute to the hypo. He can become transfixed by the sound of a buzzing light or a whirring fridge. When his senses are overloaded, he experiences a sensory shutdown. Another story is of a child who has never used a school toilet in his entire schooling due to a toilet phobia brought on by an early traumatic experience from the sudden onset of high-impact noise from a high-speed hand dryer in a toilet in a public museum. Another story is of the blind man who uses a white cane to aid orientation and scan for steps and curbs, and how he is exhausted by the insistent torrent of urban noise as he orally hunts familiar cues and patterns of the environment that he relies on for safe travel. Another story of a young boy with cerebral palsy who uses a frame for support. As well as his mobility being challenged, he has a pronounced startle reflex which causes him to jump at loud sounds. This is doubly difficult as due to his immobility he cannot easily move from the source of the noise. Another story is of a middle-aged man with hyperacusis. Hyperacusis is an increased sensitivity to particular frequencies. This man lives in a social housing apartment and finds the incessant environmental noise ingress from his neighbours and the adjacent street intolerable. The council does not sympathise, and his GP, unacquainted with the condition, classes him as a hypochondriac. Another story of an older woman who has spent her life as a carer for her psychotic son who also suffers from hyperacusis. She has learnt to habitually monitor the environment for loudness on his behalf and has oversensitized herself in the process, becoming more and more intolerant to everyday sounds. Another story of a musician who suffers from a mix of noise-induced hearing loss, tinnitus, hyperacusis, and vertigo. He cannot tolerate music and music making anymore. Not only does he suffer the loss of his passion, the continuous tinnitus in both ears is making him borderline suicidal. The doctor tells him there is no cure, and this intensifies the negative feelings and the loudness of the tinnitus. Tinnitus is a continuous ringing or noise in the ears that is a symptom of hearing damage as a result of exposure to loud noises. There's an important lesson for all of us as music and sound designers here to protect our ears, to avoid exposure to high levels of sound, to minimize the use of headphones for extended periods of time. Another story is of a young woman with misphonia. Misphonia is a condition that results in extreme emotional responses to particular sounds. This woman is obliged to eat alone due to her strong negative emotions triggered by the eating sounds of others. A fellow passenger innocently opens a packet of crisps on a bus and she is filled with uncontrollable anger. Another story describes the environment in a hospital where the incessant bleeps of the neonatal intensive care unit, where the premature baby's hearing is low down in the list of existential priorities. I hope these stories have helped you to consider the world into which your products as music and sound designers may have varying impacts on different listeners. The study of aural diversity is a timely reminder of diversity in general and our responsibilities as professionals in the field of music and sound design. And so, as this is our final lecture in the series for Audio Cultures, I'd like to draw a few conclusions. We started the semester not clear on what audio culture might mean, and we've come to the conclusion that audio culture is a diverse subject area encompassing production, consumption, regulation, identity, and representation. Sound is both a relational and a cultural phenomenon, but as designers we are aided by scientific and engineering principles. Listening is central to everything we do. Normative conceptions of listening and listeners hide the reality of both specialist listening skills that we are in the process of developing and aural diversity. As sound creators, we must refine our craft and think carefully about the audience. And that's the conclusion of our subject for 2020. I hope you've enjoyed Audio Cultures, and I hope it's provided you with some things to think about and some developing skills that you will refine in subsequent subjects. Thanks for participating.